The file had been sitting in the precursor archive for longer than my civilization had existed, and the moment I opened it, I understood that some things are buried for a reason. My name is Draenal Vosk. I am a senior linguist at the Galactic Naming Registry, which is exactly as boring as it sounds. My job, for the past 47 years, has been to cross-reference the names of newly catalogued worlds against the ancient naming codex, a database assembled by the precursor cartographers billions of years before any living species drew its first breath. Every planet in the galaxy has two names, the one its inhabitants give it, and the one the precursors assigned when they map the cosmos from edge to edge. My department matches them, files them, and moves on. We have processed over 900 billion entries in the history of the registry. Not one of them has ever made my blood run cold. Until today. The request came through standard channels. A newly contacted species had been granted provisional observer status in the Galactic Council. Their homeworld was the third planet orbiting a yellow dwarf star in an unremarkable spiral arm of the galaxy. The inhabitants called their world Earth. They called their star Sol. By every metric the Council used to evaluate emerging civilizations, they were ordinary, mid-gravity physiology, no psionic ability, no hive coordination, no faster-than-light drives of their own design. They had arrived at the galactic stage aboard a borrowed transport ship, quiet and polite, and largely ignored by the political machinery that surrounded them. The Council had assigned them a small observation booth on the lowest tier of the chamber, the kind of seat reserved for species no one expected to hear from again. A footnote civilization, given a footnote chair. My job was simple. Run their star system through the codex, retrieve the precursor designation for the third planet, file it alongside the local name, and close the entry. I had done this thousands of times before. It should have taken me less than an hour. It should have been the most forgettable task of my week. Instead, it became the most significant event of my life. I entered the coordinates for Sol into the codex terminal. The system responded instantly, which was normal. Every star the precursors had catalogued returned a match within seconds, and the precursors had catalogued every star. The designation for the star itself was unremarkable, a standard alphanumeric string indicating its spectral class, position within the spiral arm, and approximate age. Nothing unusual, nothing that would cause a senior linguist to pause. But when the entry for the third planet loaded, my screen flickered in a way I had never seen before. The planetary designation field was blank, completely empty. In its place was a single glyph, pulsing in deep red against the dark background of the terminal display, and beside it, a classification tag I did not recognize. Crimson Archive. I stared at it for a long time. In 47 years of working with the Codex, I had encountered 4 classification tiers. Standard, which covered the vast majority of entries. Restricted, which applied to worlds with ongoing territorial disputes. Sealed, which covered entries relating to extinct civilizations whose records were preserved for historical purposes. And Legacy, which applied to entries so old that the data had partially degraded beyond reliable translation. These 4 tiers encompassed every planet in the database. I had never seen a 5th tier. I had never even heard of one mentioned in passing. Crimson Archive was not listed in any training manual, any procedural guide, any institutional document I had ever read across nearly 5 decades of service. It existed outside the system I thought I understood completely. I should have flagged it and moved on. That is what protocol demanded. When a classification exceeds your clearance level, you file a notation, pass the entry upward, and let someone with higher authority handle it. That is the rule. That is what a responsible archivist does. But something about that pulsing red glyph held me in place. A gravity I could not name pulling at a part of my mind I did not normally use. It was not curiosity, exactly. It was closer to the feeling you get when you are standing at the edge of a cliff and looking down, and your body knows something important about the depth below before your mind does. I filed an access petition. Standard form, standard language. Nothing that should have raised any flags. I expected the request to sit in a queue for weeks, maybe months. Crimson level clearance would presumably require multiple approvals, review boards, institutional sign-offs from departments I had never interacted with. I submitted the form and turned back to my other work, already composing the notation I would send to my supervisor, explaining the delay. The petition was granted in 4 minutes. Not by any living authority, not by any supervisor, review board, or institutional officer. The approval stamp came from an automated precursor protocol embedded in the codex itself, a subroutine that had apparently been dormant for eons, waiting with inhuman patience for someone with registry credentials to request access to this specific file. The protocol recognized my clearance, verified my identity against the codex's own authentication matrix, and opened the entry without any oversight from the council, the registry, or any other institution in the galaxy. It was as if the precursors had left a door unlocked billions of years ago and simply waited for someone to find the handle. The file opened. The precursor designation for the third planet of Sol was not an alphanumeric string. It was not a coordinate reference or a spectral classification or any of the standard formats I had spent my career processing. It was a name, a true name, written in the oldest form of precursor script, the formal linguistic register that the cartographers used only for things they considered significant enough to warrant precision. I ran the glyphs through my translation matrix 3 times, because the first 2 results were identical, and I did not want to believe what they said. Tuenskide. That was what the precursors had named Earth, not a catalog number, not a data point, a title. In all the billions of entries I had processed across 47 years, I had never seen the precursors give a planet a title. They were scientists, cartographers, rational beings, who mapped the universe with mathematical precision and clinical detachment. They did not name worlds the way poets name storms. They did not attach significance to individual points of light in a galaxy filled with trillions of them. And yet here it was, etched into the oldest database in existence, glowing on my screen in characters that predated every living language in the galaxy by billions of years. Throne of Endings. I sat with that for a long time, telling myself it was an anomaly. A glitch in the translation matrix. A corruption in the source data. Something explainable. Something that would dissolve under scrutiny the way all anomalies eventually do. But the script was clean. The glyphs were unambiguous. And my translation matrix was the most advanced linguistic tool in the registry. There was no error. The precursors had looked at that small blue world spinning around its unremarkable star, and they had called it the Throne of Endings, and they had meant it. Then I noticed the annotation. Below the name, in smaller script, was a block of text I almost missed. It was written in a different dialect of precursor, older and more formal than the naming register, the kind the cartographers reserved for official warnings and institutional directives. The kind they used when they wanted to make sure that whoever read the message understood. It was not a suggestion. Translating it took me hours. The grammar was dense, layered with subordinate clauses that nested inside each other like shells within shells. The vocabulary was archaic, drawn from a period of precursor history that predated their cartographic mission by an unknown span of time. Several of the root words had no modern equivalent in any language I knew. I worked through it glyph by glyph, cross-referencing against every linguistic database I had access to, until the meaning finally resolved into something I could read. The annotation said this: "Do not archive, do not name, do not wake what sleeps in gravity and bone. The species born here will remember what we tried to forget." I read it again, and again, and a third time, as if repetition might change what the words meant. Each time, they settled deeper, like stones sinking into dark water. The precursors, the beings who had mapped every star system in the galaxy without hesitation, who had cataloged black holes and neutron stars, and the radiation-soaked wreckage of dead civilizations, without so much as a footnote of concern, had looked at one small planet and written a warning. Not a scientific observation, not a clinical assessment, not a measured notation for future researchers. A warning, raw and urgent, and laced with something that looked, across the gulf of billions of years, very much like fear. And the warning said, "Do not wake them." I closed the file. I sat in my chair in the quiet of the archive, surrounded by the soft hum of the codex terminals and the gentle glow of 900 billion planetary entries arranged in neat rows of light across the darkened room, and I tried to make my hands stop shaking. They would not stop. Some part of me, some deep and wordless part that lived below thought and reason and the comfortable routines of professional life, understood what I had found before the rest of me could catch up. The humans had been sitting quietly in their observation booth on the lowest tier of the council chamber for 3 weeks. They smiled politely at delegates who passed them in the corridors. They took notes during sessions with the attentive focus of students at a lecture. They asked thoughtful questions about trade regulations and transit protocols and the proper procedures for filing observer reports. They were, by every visible measure, the least threatening species the galaxy had ever encountered. And the precursors, the oldest and most advanced civilization ever to exist, the beings who had built the codex and mapped the stars, and then vanished without explanation, had been afraid of them. I left the archive that evening and walked through the streets of the capital station, watching the lights of 1,000 species flicker in the windows of their embassies and residences and commercial districts, and I wondered how many of them knew, how many of them had their own ancient records, their own buried names for that little blue world at the edge of a spiral arm. How many of them had looked at the humans sitting quietly in their booth and felt the same nameless unease I felt now, the sense that something enormous was hiding in plain sight, patient and still and waiting, with a calm that was itself a kind of power. I told myself I would report the finding in the morning. I told myself it was probably nothing. I told myself the precursors had been dead for billions of years, and their warnings meant nothing to the living galaxy. But I did not sleep that night, and when the morning came, I did not feel better. I felt worse, because in the darkness, lying in my quarters with the words of the annotation repeating in my mind like a rhythm I could not silence, I had begun to understand that the precursors had not simply been afraid. They had been trying to tell us something, and we had not been listening. I brought the file to Director Scythe Mall at the start of the next cycle, expecting the same measured indifference she applied to everything that crossed her desk. Scythe had been running the naming registry for over a century. She had seen anomalies, translation errors, corrupted files, and bureaucratic tangles that would have driven lesser administrators to resign in despair. Nothing surprised her. Nothing unsettled her composure. She once processed a contested naming dispute between two species that had been at war for 800 years, and she resolved it over lunch without raising her voice. Her steadiness was legendary. It was the foundation upon which the entire registry operated. I stood in her office and recited the precursor annotation from memory, because I had not been able to stop thinking about it since the moment I translated it, and the words had embedded themselves in my mind with the permanence of scars. Do not archive. Do not name. Do not wake what sleeps in gravity and bone. The species born here will remember what we tried to forget. Scythe set down her stylus. The small click it made against the surface of her desk was the only sound in the room. She did not speak for nearly a full minute, which was unlike her. Scythe was a being of precise efficiency. She did not waste time. She did not allow silence to accumulate in conversations. Every moment in her office was allocated to a purpose. An empty space was something she eliminated with the same thoroughness she applied to filing errors. But now she sat motionless, looking at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. An expression that told me the words I had spoken had landed somewhere deep inside her and hit something she had been carrying for a long time. Then she stood, walked to her office door, and locked it. Not with the standard magnetic seal that provided routine privacy, with the manual override. The physical bolt that existed for situations where even electronic security was not trusted, where the integrity of the conversation required the oldest and most fundamental form of barrier between inside and outside. I had worked in the registry for 47 years and had never seen that bolt engaged. I had not even known it was functional. She returned to her desk, sat down, and asked me to repeat the annotation. I did. She asked me to confirm the classification tier. I confirmed it. Crimson Archive. She asked me to confirm that the precursor protocol had granted access automatically, without institutional approval, without any living being authorizing the disclosure. I confirmed that as well. Then she told me something that turned the unease in my chest into something closer to dread. 3 other worlds in the history of the Codex had carried Crimson Archive designations. Scythe knew this because she had encountered one of them decades ago, early in her career, and had been quietly tracking the classification ever since, following its threads through the archive with the patient obsession of someone who had stumbled upon a pattern and could not stop seeing it. All three worlds were now dead systems, not destroyed by any weapon or cosmic event, not conquered by any invading force, emptied. Every species that had ever evolved on a Crimson Archive world had followed the same trajectory, the same arc drawn across the span of history, with a consistency that defied coincidence. They rose, they expanded. They became the dominant force of their era, the apex civilization that shaped the galaxy around them, bending the course of history to their will. And then they vanished. Not gradually, not through decline or collapse, or the slow erosion of institutional decay. They simply ceased to be present, as if they had stepped through a door that no one else could see, and closed it behind them without a sound. No one knew where they went. No records existed of their departure. No farewell transmissions. No final messages. No explanations left for the civilizations that inherited the galaxy after them. The species they left behind found only silence. Empty worlds with infrastructure still intact. Cities still lit by power sources that continued to function without maintenance. Transit systems still running on schedules that no one was using. Everything in place, everything operational, and no living presence anywhere. As if every individual had stood up from whatever they were doing, walked away, and never come back. The precursors had encountered all three of these disappearances during their mapping mission. After the third one, they stopped. The greatest cartographic project in galactic history, the survey that had cataloged every star system across the entire breadth of the known universe, simply ended. Mid-survey, incomplete. The precursors set down their instruments and closed their files and vanished shortly after, becoming the fourth great disappearance in a pattern that no one had connected until Scythe Mall, sitting alone in an archive decades ago, had pulled the thread and seen the shape of what it wove. Scythe looked at me across her desk, and for the first time in the century I had known her, I saw fear in her eyes. Not the controlled apprehension of a cautious administrator. Fear. The kind that comes from deep inside, from the part of a being that understands threats on a level that precedes thought. Earth was the fourth. She told me we were going to the inner council, not through channels, not through intermediaries, not through the slow and careful machinery of institutional communication that normally governed interactions between the registry and the governing body of the galaxy. Directly. Now. Immediately. She told me to bring every piece of data I had extracted from the codex, every translation note, every glyph, every fragment of precursor text. She told me I was going to present it personally, as the discovering officer of record, because the council needed to hear it from the person who had actually opened the file, not from a summary or a report, or a second-hand account filtered through layers of bureaucratic interpretation. I asked her if she thought the council would take it seriously. She did not answer the question directly. Instead, she said something I will never forget, because it was the moment I realized that this was not a filing anomaly, or a translation curiosity, or an interesting footnote in the history of galactic cartography. She said that the precursors were the most rational beings who had ever existed, beings who built their entire civilization on observation and evidence, and the methodical elimination of error. And rational beings do not write warnings about things that are not real. Then she unlocked the door and walked out, and I followed her, because I did not know what else to do. The inner council chamber sits at the center of the capital station, a vast circular room ringed by 7 elevated platforms, one for each of the elder species that have governed the galaxy for longer than most civilizations have existed. The ceiling arcs overhead like the interior of a cathedral, and the acoustics are designed so that a whisper from the central floor can be heard clearly on every platform. It is a room built for significance, for decisions that will echo across star systems and centuries. I had never been inside it. Archivists do not attend council sessions. We file their records after the fact, cataloging decisions and resolutions with the same methodical precision we apply to planetary names. We are the people who work in the basement of galactic governance. We are not supposed to be in the room where the decisions are made. But Scythe had pulled strings I did not know she possessed, and within 2 hours of leaving her office, I was standing on the central floor of the council chamber, looking up at the 7 platforms and the beings who occupied them, the Vithari, ancient and careful, their crystalline bodies catching the light like living prisms. The Draxians, massive and armored, their military reputation preceding them, across every sector of the galaxy like the shadow of a mountain. The collective of Vren, a networked intelligence that spoke through a single chosen vessel, with the coordinated precision of 1,000,000 minds operating as one. The hegemony of Ran, whose representative sat motionless and silent, watching everything with eyes that had seen 9,000 years of galactic warfare pass beneath their gaze. And 3 others, each old enough and powerful enough to shape the future of 100 star systems with a single vote. I presented the file. I displayed the precursor glyphs on the central screen, each one magnified to fill the visual field, their ancient shapes stark against the display's dark background. I read the annotation aloud, and my voice did not shake, though I cannot explain how I managed that when my hands were trembling at my sides. I showed them the classification tier, the automated access protocol, and the full translation chain that converted the ancient script into modern language, step by step, glyph by glyph, so that every member of the council could see that the translation was not an interpretation, but a precise rendering of what the precursors had written. I was thorough, I was precise, I was methodical. I was, for perhaps the only time in my life, the most important person in the room, and I handled it the way an archivist handles everything, with methodology, with care, with the steady, unglamorous competence that no one notices until the moment it matters. The reactions were mixed, which I had expected. The Vren Collective dismissed it as historical curiosity, a relic of an extinct civilization's superstitions. The Draxian commander frowned deeply, but said nothing, his armored jaw set in a line that suggested he was processing the information against his own experience, rather than reacting to it emotionally. 2 of the younger elder species exchanged glances that suggested skepticism, the kind of skepticism that comes from beings who have not lived long enough to learn that ancient warnings are usually written by people who learned the hard way. But the Vithari ambassador, Counselor Threen, did something that silenced every other voice in the chamber and made the temperature of the room seem to drop by several degrees. She asked me for the full precursor etymological chain, not just the translated name, but the root components of each glyph, the linguistic architecture that showed how the precursors had constructed each element of the title, and what each element carried in terms of historical and cultural weight. It was a precise and deeply informed request, the kind that only someone with extensive knowledge of precursor linguistics would think to ask. I provided it. I displayed the breakdown on the central screen, showing how each element of the name carried weight and history and intention that the simple translation could not fully convey. Throne, not a seat of governance in the political sense, but a place of origin, a source point. The root from which all things flow outward, the center of a pattern that extends beyond the boundaries of the pattern itself. Endings, not destruction, not death, not annihilation. Completion, the final form of something that has passed through every intermediate stage and reached its ultimate expression. The last shape a thing takes before it becomes something entirely new. Not an end, but an arrival. Counselor Threen stood up. She was tall, even for a Vithari, and when she rose from her platform, the light that passed through her crystalline body scattered across the chamber in fractured rainbows that played across the walls and floor like living things. She looked at the screen for a long time, her faceted eyes reflecting the precursor glyphs in 1,000 tiny repetitions. Then she turned to her aide, whispered something I could not hear from the central floor, and walked out of the chamber. No explanation, no formal statement for the record, no diplomatic courtesy or procedural acknowledgement. She simply left, her footsteps echoing in the sudden silence of a room that had forgotten how to breathe. The chamber erupted into murmured confusion. A Vithari counselor had never walked out of a session in the entire recorded history of the council. Never. Not during crises, not during wars, not during the most heated disputes in a political body that spanned thousands of years of contentious history. The Vithari did not do things without reason. They were the most deliberate species in the galaxy, every action calculated against centuries of precedent, every decision weighed with a patience that other species found maddening. For Threen to leave like that, without protocol, without explanation, without so much as a formal objection, or a request for recess, meant something had broken through her composure in a way that nothing in her 400-year career had managed before. Within hours, the Vithari recalled their entire diplomatic corps from every station within 3 jumps of human-occupied space. Every ambassador, every trade liaison, every cultural attaché, every minor functionary and support staff member, all of them, pulled back without warning, without explanation, without formal filing with the diplomatic registry. The withdrawal was so sudden, so complete, and so unprecedented that it triggered automated alerts in the Council's early warning system, the kind of alerts that were designed to detect the opening moves of a full-scale interstellar invasion. But it was not an invasion. It was a retreat. The Vithari were not advancing toward anything. They were pulling away from something. And the something they were pulling away from was a small blue planet orbiting a yellow dwarf star in an unremarkable spiral arm of a galaxy that suddenly felt much smaller and much more dangerous than it had the day before. Other council members noticed. Of course they noticed. The Vithari were one of the pillars of galactic stability. They were the species that other species looked to when they wanted to know whether a situation was truly serious or merely dramatic. When the Vithari moved, everyone watched. And what they saw now was fear. Not the calculated repositioning of a cautious power. Not the strategic adjustment of a civilization hedging its bets against an uncertain future. But fear. The older kind. The kind that comes from recognizing something you had hoped was only a myth, only a story told in the dark to frighten children, and discovering that it is real, and it is close, and it has been here the whole time. I tried to reach the Vithari linguistic archives, hoping their scholars could explain their ambassador's reaction, hoping that someone in their vast institutional memory could provide context for a response that had shaken the political foundations of the galaxy. I sent formal requests through institutional channels. I sent informal queries through academic networks. And finally, in desperation, I sent a personal message to a colleague I had worked with decades ago, a Vithari etymologist named Soreth who had collaborated with me on a paper about precursor naming conventions, and who I had always considered a friend, or at least the closest thing to a friend that cross-species professional relationships allowed. The reply came from an automated system. It was brief, and it was the last communication I would ever receive from the Vithari on this subject. It said, "We have an older name for that world, older than the precursors. We do not speak it. You should not have opened that file." The channel closed. Not temporarily, permanently. The Vithari had severed their entire linguistic archive from the Galactic Communication Network, something they had never done in the recorded history of interstellar civilization. Not during the Shorn Wars, not during the Cascade Plague, not during the 3 greatest crises the galaxy had faced in 10,000 years. They had sealed themselves away from the conversation entirely, and the message they left behind was not a warning or an explanation. It was a confession. They had known. They had always known. And they had said nothing. I sat in my quarters that night, staring at the wall, trying to process what was happening around me. I was an archivist. I filed names. I cross-referenced databases. I lived in the quiet margins of galactic civilization, doing work that no one noticed and no one celebrated, and I had been content with that for my entire adult life. I did not want to be the person who discovered something that made an entire civilization retreat behind its borders overnight. I did not want to be the person who made a Vithari ambassador walk out of a council session for the first time in history. I did not want to be standing at the center of something that felt like it was growing larger with every passing hour, pulling in more voices, more fear, more silence, like a gravity well that bent everything around it toward a single inescapable point. But I was. And the thing I kept coming back to, the thing I could not shake no matter how many times I told myself to stop thinking about it, was the precursor annotation. Not the warning itself, but the specific word they chose. Wake. Do not wake what sleeps in gravity and bone. As if the humans were not fully realized yet. As if everything the galaxy had seen so far, the polite diplomats, the quiet observers, the unremarkable species in the lowest booth, was the sleeping version. And whatever came after waking was something the precursors, the Vithari, and apparently every ancient civilization that had ever encountered the concept of Earth, did not want to see. I did not sleep that night either. 3 days after the Vithari withdrawal, everything got worse. I was summoned to a classified session with the full security directorate, a body I had not known existed until the message arrived on my terminal, bearing clearance codes that overrode every lock in the registry and made my screen flash with priority indicators I had never seen before. The directorate operated in a section of the capital station that did not appear on any public map, behind doors that required biometric verification from 3 different species simultaneously. I was escorted by 2 Draxian guards who did not speak to me and did not answer my questions, and moved through the corridors with the silent purposefulness of beings who considered conversation an unnecessary distraction from their duties. The room was smaller than the council chamber, windowless, lined with materials that absorbed sound and electromagnetic radiation in equal measure. But the tension inside it was immeasurably greater than anything I had felt in the grand ceremonial space above. Every species represented on the directorate had sent their most senior intelligence officer. These were not diplomats. These were not politicians. These were the people who managed threats, who assessed risks, who decided which dangers warranted action, and which could be monitored, and which could be ignored. They were the shadow structure behind the visible governance of the galaxy, and they had called me, a linguist who filed planetary names for a living, into their domain, because the threat they were assessing was a word. They wanted me to go deeper into the codex. They wanted me to find out what the precursors meant by throne of endings in operational terms. Not the etymology, not the linguistic history, not the academic analysis, the practical implications. What did the name predict? What did it describe? What, exactly, had the precursors seen when they looked at that world and decided it deserved a title instead of a number? I told them I would need unrestricted access to the deepest archive layers of the codex, sections that had been locked since before any living species joined the council, since before the capital station itself was built. They granted it without hesitation, which told me more about the depth of their fear than any words could have. These were people who did not grant anything without extensive deliberation and careful calculation of risk. The speed of their approval was itself a measure of how badly they needed answers. I spent 6 days in the archive. I did not leave the building. Food was brought to me by silent attendants, who placed it on the table beside my terminal, and left without speaking. I slept on a narrow cot that someone had set up in the corner of the room, sleeping in short intervals of 2 or 3 hours at a time, my dreams populated by red glyphs and ancient warnings. I worked through layer after layer of precursor data, following threads that branched and merged and sometimes dead-ended in corrupted files that had degraded beyond recovery over the billions of years since they were created. But enough survived, enough pieces remained intact to assemble a picture that made the annotation I had originally found look like a gentle understatement. The precursors had not just mapped the galaxy, they had been running from something. This was the revelation that rewrote everything I thought I knew about galactic history. The greatest cartographic project ever undertaken, the survey that had catalogued every star system in every spiral arm across the entire breadth of the observable galaxy, had not been a scientific endeavor. It had not been driven by curiosity, or the pursuit of knowledge, or the noble ambition to understand the cosmos. It had been a search, a desperate, systematic, civilization-wide search. The precursors were looking for safe systems, worlds that were far enough from certain gravitational and biological signatures that they could be deemed clean, habitable, safe from something they did not name directly, but clearly feared with every fiber of their being. Their entire civilization, their entire purpose in the final phase of their existence, had been organized around a single question: which parts of the galaxy were safe and which were not? And the criteria they used to determine safety were terrifyingly specific. I found the models buried in the deepest layer of the archive, beneath strata of data that had not been accessed since the precursors themselves had placed it there. Mathematical projections of extraordinary complexity, evolutionary algorithms that modeled the development of life across millions of generations, environmental simulations that tracked the interaction between planetary conditions and biological adaptation over spans of time that made my mind ache to contemplate. All of it focused on a single question: what kind of species would emerge from a world with a specific set of characteristics? The precursors had identified a combination of planetary features that, according to their calculations, would inevitably produce a type of organism they had never directly encountered, but whose theoretical existence terrified them enough to build their entire final civilization around avoiding it. The combination was precise. A heavy metal core generating a powerful magnetic field that would shield the surface from cosmic radiation, while simultaneously creating a complex electromagnetic environment. A violent, oversized moon, creating extreme tidal forces that would stress oceanic and atmospheric systems in patterns that accelerated evolutionary adaptation. A radiation belt that bathed the upper atmosphere in constant energy, filtering down to the surface in doses that were not lethal, but were sufficient to drive a constant low-level mutation rate. An oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere thick enough to sustain high-energy metabolisms, the kind that burned fuel at rates most galactic biologies could not sustain for more than minutes. And a surface gravity of approximately 1 standard unit, a figure that meant nothing to most galactic species, but that the precursors flagged with the equivalent of a scream, because 1 standard unit was crushing by the standards of 90% of inhabited worlds. Strong enough to forge bones as dense as structural alloys and muscles that could operate under loads that would cripple any other known biological architecture. The precursors called the hypothetical species that would emerge from such a world the Awoken. Not because they would be more intelligent than other species, not because they would possess any exotic ability, any psionic talent, any supernatural power, but because they would be organisms shaped by maximum hostility from the moment of their conception. Every cell in their bodies would be a product of relentless, unending environmental pressure. Every biological system, from the macro-architecture of their skeletons to the micro-machinery of their immune responses, would be optimized for one thing: survival under conditions that would kill most galactic species within hours of exposure. They would not be special in any mystical sense. They would simply be hardened beyond anything the galaxy had ever produced, and the difference between special and hardened, according to the precursors, was everything. Special could be matched. Hardened could only be endured. I cross-referenced the precursor predictions against the biological data the Council had collected from the human delegation during their standard medical screening upon arrival at the capital station. The screening was routine, performed on every new species as part of the onboarding process, and the results had been filed without comment by the medical staff who processed them. No one had flagged anything unusual. No one had looked closely enough to see what was hiding in the data, because no one had been looking for it. I looked closely, and what I found made me push back from the terminal, fold my hands on the desk in front of me, and stare at the ceiling for a very long time, while my understanding of the galaxy rearranged itself around a new center of gravity. Every single prediction matched. The precursors had theorized that an awoken species would possess a regenerative capability far beyond the galactic norm, a healing factor that would allow them to recover from injuries that would be permanently disabling or fatal to most known biologies. The human medical data confirmed it. Humans regrew damaged tissue. They mended broken bones. They healed from wounds that would have killed a Draxian, a species renowned for their physical toughness. Their immune systems fought off microbial invaders with a ferocity that the medical staff had noted as unusual in the margins of their report, but had not flagged as significant, because unusual was not the same as alarming, and they had not understood that in this case, unusual was exactly the word that should have set off every alarm in the building. The precursors had predicted that an awoken species would be able to function without sleep for extended periods, pushing through exhaustion barriers that would shut down the central nervous systems of other organisms. The human data confirmed this as well. Humans could remain operational for days without rest. Not at full capacity, but operational, functional, capable of making decisions and executing complex tasks while running on biological fumes that would have rendered any other species comatose. And their performance degradation was gradual rather than catastrophic, a slow decline instead of a sudden collapse, which meant they could push further and harder than any species that hit a wall. The precursors had predicted a species that would form cooperative bonds with predatory organisms, not by dominating them through force, but by integrating them into social structures through patience and mutual benefit. The Human Cultural Database, which I accessed with my newly expanded clearance, confirmed this in detail that left me slightly dizzy. Humans lived alongside large carnivorous animals they had domesticated over thousands of years of patient, persistent contact. They shared their homes with creatures that possessed teeth and claws, and the instincts of apex predators. They called them pets. They loved them. They grieved when they died. They had taken wolves, one of the most effective pack predators on their world, and turned them into companions through nothing more than the willingness to wait, generation after generation, until the wolves trusted them enough to stay. And then there was the prediction I kept coming back to, the one that haunted me more than any other, because it described a capability so extreme that most galactic biologists considered it a theoretical impossibility. The precursors had predicted endurance-based persistence hunting, a pursuit strategy in which the hunter does not rely on speed or strength or ambush tactics, but simply follows the prey, across any terrain, over any distance, for any duration, never faster than the prey, never stronger than the prey, simply never stopping, walking, jogging, tracking, following, hour after hour, day after day, until the prey's body fails, until its muscles seize, until its cooling system collapses, until it falls from exhaustion and cannot rise, and the hunter, still moving, still breathing, still functional, walks up to it and claims its prize. No known species in the galaxy used persistence hunting. It was discussed in academic papers as a hypothetical extreme, the way physicists discuss conditions inside a singularity, interesting to theorize about, but biologically impossible to sustain. The metabolic demands alone would burn through any known energy system within hours. The thermal regulation required would overwhelm any cooling mechanism the galaxy had documented. The skeletal stress would shatter bones not specifically engineered to absorb repetitive impact over unlimited distances. Humans were specifically engineered for it, from the ground up. Their bipedal locomotion, their sweat-based cooling system, their energy storage mechanisms, their skeletal architecture with its shock-absorbing arches and flexible tendons, all of it optimized for one purpose: to follow prey across any terrain, at any distance, for any duration, until the prey could not run anymore. It was encoded in their genome. It was the foundation upon which their entire biology was built. They did not just use persistence hunting. They were persistence hunting, given a body and a mind, and the patience of a species that had learned, over millions of years of practice, that the race does not go to the swift. It goes to the one who does not stop. I compiled the data. I organized it with the same methodical precision I brought to every task I had ever performed in my career. I prepared a presentation that was clear and comprehensive, and devoid of speculation, because the facts needed no embellishment. And then I brought it to the Security Directorate and watched the most powerful military and intelligence leaders in the galaxy absorb it, in a silence that grew heavier with every slide. No one spoke for a long time after I finished. The last slide faded from the display, leaving only the ambient glow of the room's recessed lighting, and the silence filled the space like a physical substance. General Keth Sorvon, the senior military commander of the Draxian Empire, a species that had conquered 11 star systems and held them through 3 separate galactic conflicts across 5 centuries of continuous military dominance, was the first to break the silence. He was enormous, even by Draxian standards, his armored body filling his chair like a boulder wedged into a crevice. He had commanded fleets that numbered in the thousands. He had personally led ground assaults on fortified worlds. He was, by any reasonable measure, the most experienced warrior in the room, and possibly the most experienced warrior alive. He asked one question: how many of them are there? I told him. Over 8 billion, on a single world. Sorvon set down his command tablet. He placed both of his massive hands flat on the table in front of him, and he said nothing. Not because he had nothing to say, but because the number had taken whatever he was going to say and rendered it meaningless. 11 star systems, 3 galactic conflicts, thousands of warships, centuries of military supremacy, and there were 8 billion of these beings packed onto one world. A world whose gravity and radiation, and environmental hostility, had spent millions of years forging them into something the precursors had seen in their mathematical models, and decided to run from rather than face. The silence in the room after that was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It was broken by an incoming communication that overrode every security protocol in the Directorate, cutting through encrypted channels and classified firewalls as if they were not there. A priority transmission from the hegemony of Ran, the single most feared military power in the galaxy. The hegemony had not lost a war in 9,000 years. They did not participate in the nervous chatter of lesser civilizations. They did not send priority transmissions to interspecies intelligence bodies. When the hegemony spoke, it was because something had happened that warranted their attention, and when something warranted the hegemony's attention, every species in the galaxy paid very, very close attention to what they said next. The transmission was 4 words long: "Do not provoke Earth." Not a warning issued from a position of authority. Not a strategic assessment delivered with military detachment. Not a diplomatic recommendation wrapped in careful language. A plea. The hegemony of Ran, the undefeated, the unconquered, the civilization whose name alone was enough to end wars before they started, was pleading with the rest of the galaxy to leave the humans alone. The Directorate received the transmission in stunned silence. Then someone, I do not remember who, asked the question that was on everyone's mind. How did the hegemony know? The precursor file had been classified at the highest level. The Vithari withdrawal had been noted, but not formally explained. The biological analysis had not been shared beyond this room. How did the hegemony already know what we had just discovered through days of painstaking research? The answer came from a follow-up transmission, sent directly to my personal terminal, addressed to me by name and title. It was from the hegemony's chief archivist, a position I had not known they maintained. The message said, "We have our own name for that world. We have had it for 11,000 years. You are not the first to discover what they are, Archivist Vosk. You are merely the latest." The hegemony had known. For 11,000 years, longer than most current galactic civilizations had existed, they had known. And they had kept their distance. The most aggressive military civilization in galactic history, a species that had conquered and absorbed and dominated, with a ruthlessness that made other military powers look like peacekeeping forces, had looked at Earth and decided, without any external pressure, without any treaty or agreement, without any force compelling them, to simply stay away. That was not strategy. That was not caution. That was survival instinct operating at the civilizational level, the collective wisdom of a warrior culture that had learned to recognize something it could not defeat. I left the Directorate session that evening, feeling like the floor beneath me had been replaced with something thin and fragile, like a membrane stretched over a void I could not see the bottom of. Everything I had believed about the galaxy, about the hierarchy of species, about the way power and strength and dominance were distributed among the civilizations that shared the stars, all of it was built on a foundation that had just developed a crack, and the crack had the shape of a small blue planet that everyone important had been quietly avoiding for longer than recorded history extended. The following days were consumed by something I had never witnessed in my decades of service. The Galactic Council, an institution built on procedure and precedent, and the slow, deliberate mechanics of interspecies governance, began to fracture. Not publicly, not in any way that the general population of the galaxy would notice or understand, but behind closed doors, in classified sessions and encrypted communications, and late-night meetings between ambassadors who were supposed to be rivals, the fracture spread like a crack in ice, silent and invisible, until the moment the surface gives way. A faction formed. It was led by Speaker Orith of the Collective of Wren, a networked intelligence that processed information faster than any biological mind, and had little patience for what it called emotional reasoning. Orith argued that ancient names and precursor superstitions were not a basis for galactic policy. The humans were a provisional observer species, with no faster-than-light capability and no military assets beyond their home system. They were, in practical terms, helpless. Whatever the precursors had predicted, whatever the Vithari feared, whatever the hegemony had spent 11,000 years avoiding, the fact remained that humanity was currently confined to a single star system with no means of expanding beyond it, and Orath intended to keep it that way. The proposal was elegant in its ruthlessness. A preemptive territorial restriction, implemented before the humans had the capability to resist it. Establish exclusion zones around the Sol system extending 5 light-years in every direction. Deploy jump drive interdiction satellites at every viable exit vector, preventing the development or acquisition of faster-than-light technology. Install communication monitoring stations capable of intercepting and analyzing every signal leaving the system. Implement surveillance networks to track every human vessel, every research initiative, every technological development that might move them closer to interstellar capability. A complete, permanent, irrevocable quarantine of a species that had done nothing wrong, justified entirely by the potential of what they might one day become. The motion gained traction quickly. The younger species, the ones who had not lived long enough to develop the instinctive caution that comes with deep historical awareness, saw the fear of the Vithari and the hegemony as weakness. Overreaction, superstition dressed in the language of ancient authority. They looked at the humans sitting quietly in their observation booth, taking notes and smiling politely, and asking questions about trade regulations, and they could not reconcile what they saw with the terror that the oldest civilizations in the galaxy were displaying. The containment proposal made sense to them. It was proactive. It was decisive. It was the kind of bold action that young civilizations admired, and old ones had learned to regret. The vote was scheduled for the next full council session, 7 days away. I was horrified, and not for the reason most people would assume. I had no particular attachment to humans. I had never spoken to one. I had no sentimental feelings about their right to expand, or their potential for greatness, or their place in the galactic community. My horror was purely analytical, born from what I had found in the deepest layers of the precursor archive, the layers that no one on the council or the directorate had asked me to translate, because they were too frightened or too impatient to look any further than the information they already had. But I had looked. I had spent 6 days in the archive, and I had looked at everything, and what I found in those deepest layers was the piece of the puzzle that no one else had seen, the piece that turned the entire picture from frightening to catastrophic. The 3 previous throne worlds, the 3 Crimson Archive civilizations that had risen, dominated, and vanished, had all been contained. Every single one of them. The galaxy's response to each of these species had followed the same pattern, repeated with the mechanical precision of a cycle that no one had recognized because the gaps between repetitions were measured in billions of years. Discovery, fear, containment. And containment was what made them dangerous. The precursors had documented the process with clinical precision, recording the data with the detached thoroughness of scientists observing an experiment whose outcome they already dreaded. When a throne species was restricted, when it was confined and pressured and hemmed in by the fearful civilizations that surrounded it, the environmental stress did not weaken it, it accelerated it. Every cage the galaxy built became a crucible that intensified the evolutionary pressures already at work within the contained species. Every restriction became a new selective pressure. Every attempt to hold them back forced them to adapt faster, think more creatively, cooperate more intensely, and develop capabilities they would never have needed in a galaxy that had simply left them alone. The containment did not prevent the throne species from becoming dominant. It guaranteed it. It compressed the timeline. It turned what might have been a gradual, manageable expansion into an explosive transformation that overwhelmed everything around it. The first throne species, left largely alone before containment was attempted, had taken 12,000 years to reach galactic dominance. The second, contained early in its development, reached the same level of dominance in 6,000 years. The third, contained aggressively and comprehensively, reached it in 800. The precursor's final note on this pattern was a single sentence, 3 words long, blunt and unadorned by the careful qualifications that characterized their scientific writing. Resistance accelerates them. I read those 3 words and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that the Council was about to make the worst mistake in galactic history, not because the containment would fail, though it would, but because its failure was the mechanism by which the precursor's prediction would come true. The cage itself was the catalyst. The fear itself was the fuel. Everything the Council was afraid of would be created by the act of trying to prevent it. I broke protocol. I did something I had never done in my career. something that violated every procedural guideline in the registry and every professional boundary I had maintained for 47 years. Something that could have ended my position, my reputation, and my place in the institution I had served for nearly 5 decades. I contacted the Human Observer delegation directly. They were housed in a modest suite on one of the lower residential levels, the kind of accommodations assigned to species the council did not consider important enough to impress. I sent a message requesting a meeting, using my personal credentials rather than my institutional ones, and I included enough detail about the precursor file and its implications to make it clear that this was not a social call or an academic inquiry. The response came within minutes. A simple acknowledgement and a room number. I went alone. There were 4 of them. 2 men and 2 women, seated around a simple table, in a room that smelled faintly of something warm and bitter that I would later learn was coffee. They were smaller than I expected. Most of the species I worked with were larger than humans, and I had unconsciously been imagining them as physically imposing, as if the precursor's fear should manifest in obvious physical menace. They were not. They were soft-skinned, slender, unremarkable in every visible way. If I had passed them in a corridor without knowing what they were, I would not have looked twice. That, I realized, was the point. The most dangerous thing about the Awoken was that they did not look dangerous. Their lead diplomat was a woman named Claire Ashford. She had short brown hair and steady eyes, and a calm that I initially mistook for indifference, but would later recognize as something entirely different. She listened as I explained everything. The precursor file, the Crimson Archive classification, the name, Throne of Endings. The annotation, with its warning about what slept in gravity and bone. The Vithari withdrawal, the hegemony's plea, the biological data and its match against billion-year-old predictions. The 3 previous throne species. The pattern of containment and acceleration. The vote scheduled for 5 days from now. The margin by which it was expected to pass. I held nothing back. I showed her the precursor models on my portable display, the evolutionary predictions rendered in elegant mathematical notation, the precise match between their ancient projections and actual human biology. I showed her the annotation. I showed her the pattern. I showed her everything, because I had decided that whatever happened next, the humans deserved to know what was being said about them in rooms they were not allowed to enter. Claire Ashford listened to all of it without interrupting. Her 3 colleagues listened as well, their expressions shifting through surprise, recognition, and finally something I could not name, something that lived in the space between acceptance and resignation. When I finished, the room was quiet. I expected fear, or outrage, or denial, or confusion, or some combination of all of those, the kind of emotional turbulence that accompanies the discovery that the entire galaxy has been debating whether to cage you while you sat in an observation booth taking notes about trade regulations. What I got instead was something that rearranged my understanding of the species I was sitting across from. Claire Ashford nodded slowly, as if confirming something she had long suspected but never had external evidence for, and she said, "We know what we are. We have always known. We just hoped we would have more time before you figured it out." The statement was not delivered as a threat. There was no aggression in it, no bravado, no defiance, no chest-thumping assertion of superiority. It was spoken with something I could only describe as sadness, a quiet, heavy sadness, like the weight of a truth carried too long by too few, a burden that no one outside your species would ever understand. I stared at her. Of all the responses I had anticipated, this was not among them. I had expected the humans to be shocked by the precursor analysis. I had expected them to deny it, to insist that they were not what the ancient models predicted, to protest that they were peaceful and harmless and undeserving of the galaxy's fear. Instead, their lead diplomat was telling me they already knew, that they had always known, that the precursor's ancient mathematical projections had not revealed anything to the humans that the humans had not already understood about themselves through simple self-observation across the long arc of their history. One of her colleagues, a tall man named Daniel Perry, spoke next. He said, "We call it being human. The capacity for endurance, the refusal to stop, the ability to adapt to anything the universe throws at us and keep going. We do not think of it as special. It is simply what we are. It is what our world made us." The other man, Liam Holt, leaned forward in his chair. He said, "The question has never been whether we could become what your precursors predicted. The question has always been whether we would choose to." I asked him what he meant. He said, "Every prediction in that file assumes we will be pushed, contained, restricted, forced into a corner where the only option left is to fight our way out. And if that happens, yes, we will become exactly what they feared. Not because we want to, but because that is what we do when we have no other choice. We endure, we adapt, we overcome. It is not a conscious decision. It is biology, responding to pressure the way it has always responded, by getting stronger. But if no one pushes, if no one builds a cage, if no one makes us fight, then we can choose a different path. We have been trying to choose a different path for as long as we have existed as a civilization. It has not always worked. We have failed many times, but we keep trying. That is also what we are." Claire Ashford looked at me, and her steady eyes held mine, and she asked me a question that changed the shape of everything I had been thinking since the moment I opened the Crimson Archive file. She said, "Did the precursors ever find a throne species that chose peace?" The question hit me like a physical force. I had read every file, every fragment, every surviving piece of data from the deepest layers of the codex, and I knew the answer. But knowing it and speaking it aloud were different things, because the answer carried implications that extended far beyond the scope of a historical fact. I said, "No, none of the 3 previous throne species chose peace." Claire nodded, as if she had expected that answer. Then she said, "But were any of them offered it?" I opened my mouth to respond and stopped, because I had found something in the archive that I had not yet shared with anyone. Not the Directorate, not Scythe Mall, not any of the intelligence officers or military commanders who had been poring over my findings for days. A fragment at the very end of the precursor records, buried beneath layers of corrupted data, barely legible, written in the oldest and most formal dialect the precursors possessed, the dialect they reserved for their most important and most carefully considered observations. It was an unfinished sentence, the last thing the precursors had written before they vanished from the galaxy forever. The sentence read, "Perhaps if one were welcomed rather than..." and then nothing. The rest was gone, lost to time, or deliberately erased, or simply never completed because the beings who were writing it had vanished before they could finish the thought. The most advanced civilization in galactic history had begun a sentence about the throne species, a thought about what might happen if someone tried a different approach, and they had never finished it. I told Claire about the fragment. She listened, and for the first time since I had begun speaking, something shifted in her expression. The sadness was still there, underlying everything like a foundation, but beneath it, pushing up through the weight of it, something else appeared, something that looked, impossibly, like hope. She said, "That sentence, the unfinished one, do you think they were going to say welcomed rather than feared?" I said I did not know. No one could know. The precursors were gone, their civilization dissolved into the same silence that had swallowed the throne species before them, and their last thought was a broken sentence that could have meant anything. Welcomed rather than feared. Welcomed rather than fought. Welcomed rather than caged. Welcomed rather than destroyed. Any of those completions would fit the grammar. Any of those endings would make sense. She said, "Then let us finish it. Let us be the proof that the sentence ends the way it should." I left the human delegation's quarters that evening with a weight in my chest that was different from the dread I had been carrying for days. It was not lighter exactly, but it was different in kind. The dread was still there, heavy and cold and persistent. The containment vote was still scheduled. The council was still fractured. Everything I had discovered still pointed toward a collision between the galaxy's oldest instincts and a species that had been marked as dangerous before it ever drew breath. But there was something else now, a fragment, an unfinished sentence, and a woman with steady eyes who wanted to complete it. The vote was in 3 days, and I, Drenal Vosk, a quiet archivist who had never spoken at a council session in his life, who had spent 47 years filing names in a basement, and never once imagined himself standing on the floor of the most powerful chamber in the galaxy, had made a decision. I was going to speak. The morning of the vote arrived with a weight that pressed down on the Capitol station like a change in atmospheric pressure before a storm. The council chamber was fuller than I had ever seen it, fuller than anyone could remember seeing it in recent history. Every species with a seat had sent their most senior representative, and many had sent additional delegation members who filled the advisory rows behind each platform. The observation galleries were packed to standing capacity. The lower tiers, normally half empty during routine sessions, overflowed with diplomatic staff, intelligence officers, military advisors, and analysts who had been following the classified briefings with growing alarm and had found ways to secure seats for the vote that would determine how the galaxy responded to the discovery that Earth was the fourth throne world. The atmosphere was charged with the particular tension that precedes irreversible decisions, the kind of tension that compresses time and makes every moment feel both too fast and impossibly slow, as if the universe itself is holding its breath. Speaker Orath of the Vren Collective presented the containment motion first. The presentation was clinical, efficient, and devastating in its thoroughness. Orath did not appeal to emotion, because the Vren Collective did not experience emotion in any way that individual biological species would recognize. The proposal was presented as pure logic, supported by probability models and resource calculations, and strategic assessments that marched across the central display with the relentless precision of a mathematical proof. Territorial exclusion zones extending 5 light-years in every direction from Sol. Jump drive interdiction satellites positioned at every viable exit vector from the system. Communication monitoring stations capable of intercepting and analyzing every signal leaving human-occupied space. Surveillance networks tracking every human vessel, every research initiative, every technological development that might bring them closer to interstellar capability. A permanent quarantine infrastructure maintained by a rotating consortium of contributing species, funded by a shared assessment levied across all council members. It was thorough. It was professional. It was the most comprehensive cage ever designed for a sapient species, and it was exactly what the precursors had done. 3 times. With the same logic, with the same confidence, and with the same catastrophic outcome each time. The vote count was projected on the central display. The motion was expected to pass by a margin of 4 votes. Not overwhelming, but sufficient to authorize implementation. The younger species were aligned with the Vren Collective. Several mid-tier civilizations had been swayed by the biological data, which Orath had obtained through intelligence channels I preferred not to think about. The elder species were split. The Vithari were absent entirely, having sealed their borders and refused all communication since Councillor Threen's departure from the chamber. The hegemony of Ron had not yet indicated how they would vote, and no one was willing to predict the actions of a civilization whose strategic calculations operated on a timescale that made other species' planning horizons look like impulse decisions. I requested the floor. The chamber went quiet in a way that suggested confusion rather than respect. Archivists did not speak at council sessions. The procedural right I was invoking, the discovering officer's address, was so obscure that the presiding official had to pause the proceedings and consult the original charter before confirming that it existed. It did. Buried in a subsection of the founding documents, a remnant of an era when the council valued the testimony of the people who actually found things over the opinions of the people who decided what to do about them. I was granted 5 minutes. I used every second. I did not argue against the containment proposal on moral grounds. I did not appeal to fairness or justice or the inherent rights of a species that had not been given a voice in the proceedings that would determine its future. I had considered that approach and rejected it. Morality would not move this chamber. Fear had brought these beings here, and only a greater fear, a more specific and more immediate fear, would change the trajectory of the vote. I presented the precursor pattern. 3 throne species, 3 containment attempts, 3 outcomes. I displayed the data on the central screen with the same methodical precision I brought to every archival task, laying out the timeline of each case with clear markers, showing the correlation between the initiation of containment and the acceleration of the contained species' rise to dominance. I showed them the numbers. The first throne species, developing without significant external interference, had taken 12,000 years to reach a level of capability that fundamentally altered the galactic balance of power. The second, contained early in its development, had reached the same threshold in 6,000 years. The third, contained aggressively with measures far more comprehensive than anything the Vren Collective was proposing, had reached it in 800. I showed them why. The environmental data from the precursor archive was unambiguous. Throne species were already the products of maximum hostility worlds. Their biology was built for pressure. Their evolutionary history was a continuous record of adaptation under duress, of organisms being crushed by their environment and emerging stronger from the crushing. When external pressure was applied by containing civilizations, the throne species did not respond the way other species would have responded. They did not weaken. They did not stagnate. They did not turn inward and decay. They responded the way their evolution had designed them to respond, the only way they knew how to respond. They adapted. They endured. They grew stronger. Every wall became a problem to solve. Every restriction became a challenge to overcome. Every barrier became a stimulus for innovation. Every generation born inside the cage was more capable than the last, because the cage itself had become the selective pressure that drove their development forward at an accelerating rate. Then I presented the human biological data, alongside the containment proposal, side by side on the central display, and I walked the council through what they would actually be committing to if the vote passed. I said, "You are proposing an indefinite quarantine of a species that heals from injuries that would be fatal to any of us. A species that functions without sleep for extended periods while maintaining cognitive and physical capability. A species that tracks prey across entire continents until the prey collapses from exhaustion, not because they are faster, not because they are stronger, but because they never stop moving. A species that domesticated wolves, the apex pack predators of their homeworld, not through force or technology, but by being patient enough to wait them out over hundreds of generations, until the wolves chose to stay. A species that consumes chemical compounds that would be classified as neurotoxins by our medical standards, and considers it a pleasant way to start their morning. A species that has 8 billion individuals on a single world, the highest population density of any sapient species in galactic history, and they have not destroyed themselves despite possessing the technology to do so for over a century of their time." I paused. The chamber was silent. Every eye was on the central display, where the human biological data sat alongside the precursor predictions, in a comparison that left no room for comfortable interpretations. I said, "The precursors had a word for this type of organism. They called them the Awoken, and the precursors' final observation about the Awoken was 3 words long. Resistance accelerates them. Every cage you build will make them stronger. Every restriction will make them more creative. Every year of containment will compress the timeline between what they are now and what you are afraid they will become. You are not preventing a threat. You are manufacturing one. You are building the machine that will create the very thing you are trying to prevent, and you are building it out of your own fear." I looked up at the 7 platforms, at the elder species and their advisors, and the dozens of observers, and the hundreds of analysts who had gathered to witness this vote, and I asked the only question that mattered. "How long do you intend to maintain this cage? Because they will be there when you stop. They will be there when your funding runs out. They will be there when your political will fades. They will be there when the species maintaining the interdiction satellites rotate out, and the replacements arrive, and the replacements arrive after them. They will be there, and they will be stronger than when you started, and they will remember that you caged them. How long are you prepared to sustain an eternal siege against the only species in this galaxy that was literally designed by its own world to outlast everything?" The silence that followed was absolute. Not the silence of consideration or deliberation, but the silence of a room full of powerful beings who had just been confronted with a truth they could not argue away. The Vren Collective's logic was perfect. Every calculation was correct. Every probability model was sound. But logic built on a flawed premise produces flawed conclusions. And the premise of the containment proposal, that restriction would prevent the humans from becoming what the precursors feared, was contradicted by every single piece of evidence in the archive. The premise was not just wrong, it was exactly backwards. Restriction was the accelerant. Fear was the fuel, the cage was the crucible, and the longer it burned, the harder the thing inside it would become. Then the hegemony of Ron's representative stood. His name was High Marshal Draven Koss, and he was the oldest living member of the hegemony's ruling military council. He had served in 6 major interstellar conflicts across a career that spanned centuries. He had commanded the fleet that pacified the Shorn Nebula, the single most difficult military operation undertaken in the last 1,000 years, a campaign that had lasted decades and cost more resources than most civilizations possessed. He was, by reputation and record and the quiet consensus of every military analyst in the galaxy, the most dangerous individual in the chamber. And when he stood, rising from his platform with the deliberate slowness of a being who had never needed to hurry, because no one had ever been willing to rush him, every eye in the room turned to him. Because when the hegemony spoke, the galaxy listened. That was not a tradition, it was a survival instinct. Draven Koss did not argue against the containment proposal. He did not engage with the Vren Collective's probability models or my counter-presentation of the precursor data. He did not debate. He did not discuss. He did something I had not anticipated, something that no one in the chamber had expected, something that would be recorded in the minutes of this session and studied by historians for centuries to come. He read aloud the hegemony's own ancient name for Earth. The name was in Old Rani, a language so ancient that only the hegemony's historians and ceremonial officers could still speak it fluently. He pronounced each syllable with the careful reverence of someone handling an artifact of immense fragility and immeasurable importance, a piece of his civilization's deepest memory being brought into the light for the first time in millennia. The syllables filled the chamber with a sound that was more than language, more than communication. It was a confession, spoken by a warrior culture that had never confessed to anything in 9,000 years of unbroken military supremacy. Then he translated it. The world that waits. 11,000 years ago, before most of the species in this chamber had achieved spaceflight, before the capital station had been built, before the council itself had been formed, the hegemony of Ron had looked across the galaxy at a small blue planet orbiting a yellow dwarf star and given it a name. Not Throne of Endings, the precursor designation that described what would emerge from it. The hegemony's name described what the planet did, what it had always done, what it was doing right now, in this moment, as 8 billion persistence hunters sat on its surface and looked up at the stars and waited with the infinite patience of a species that had all the time in the universe. It waited. The world waited, and the species it had forged waited with it. And the hegemony had recognized that patience 11,000 years ago and had responded the only way their warrior culture knew how to respond to something they could not defeat. They stayed away. Draven Koss looked around the chamber, his gaze passing across every platform, every tier, every face, and his voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of 9 millennia of unbroken military tradition, 9,000 years of victories and campaigns, and conquests that had made the hegemony the most feared name in the galaxy. He said, "We have fought every species in this galaxy. We have broken fleets and shattered empires and ground civilizations into dust beneath our advance. We have never encountered a species we could not outlast. Never. In 9,000 years of warfare, not once. Until we looked across the stars at a world we had never visited and a species we had never met, and we understood, with every instinct our own history had given us, that they would still be there when we were done, that they would be there when our ammunition ran out, that they would be there when our soldiers grew tired, that they would be there when our grandchildren's grandchildren grew tired. I will not vote to make them start fighting, because once they start, I do not believe they will stop." The hegemony voted against containment. The chamber absorbed the vote in a silence that had a different quality than the silences that had come before. This was not the silence of shock or fear or uncertainty. It was the silence of recalculation. The most feared military power in the galaxy had just told the room, in plain language backed by 11,000 years of strategic assessment, that the containment proposal was not just unwise, but suicidal. And every being in the chamber, regardless of their political alignment or their species' position on the vote, understood that when the hegemony of Ron told you that a fight was unwinnable, you did not argue. You listened. The vote shifted. The Vithari, who had sealed their borders and refused all participation in the proceedings, sent a single encrypted vote from behind their closed doors. Against containment. They provided no explanation. They offered no commentary. The vote arrived through an automated diplomatic channel and registered on the central display without ceremony. But it carried the weight of the oldest continuous civilization in the galaxy, a species that had seen more history pass beneath its gaze than any other, and had decided, from behind the walls of their self-imposed isolation, that caging the humans was a mistake they were not willing to make. The Draxians, whose General Keth Sorvon had sat in rigid silence since the moment I told him there were 8 billion humans, voted against containment as well. Sorvon did not speak. He did not need to. His vote spoke for him, and what it said was that the commander who had conquered 11 star systems was not willing to commit his military to an indefinite siege against a species that had been designed by its own world to outlast any force brought against it. Two mid-tier civilizations that had been leaning toward the Vren Collective changed their votes in the final minutes of the session. They were not swayed by my presentation, or by the hegemony's testimony, or by any of the emotional undercurrents flowing through the chamber. They were swayed by arithmetic. The containment proposal required the permanent commitment of military and surveillance resources from every participating species, maintained in perpetuity, without interruption, without reduction, without any endpoint. The cost, calculated over the timescales that the precursor data suggested were relevant, was not merely high, it was civilization-altering. And even at that cost, history suggested it would not work. The motion failed, by 7 votes. 7 votes separated the outcome from an alternate future in which the galaxy declared war on a species that had done nothing but sit quietly in an observation booth and take notes about trade regulations. 7 votes between a path that every piece of evidence suggested would lead to catastrophe and a path that had never been tried before. 7 votes, the thinnest margin in the history of the Council, for a decision of this magnitude. Speaker Orath accepted the result without visible reaction, because the Vren Collective did not display reactions in any way that biological species could read. But the vote count was recorded in the permanent archive, and everyone in the chamber understood that the margin was thin enough that the question would be asked again. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next year, but someday, when the humans had expanded beyond Sol, when they had developed their own jump drives, when they were no longer a small delegation in a borrowed observation booth, but a civilization with territory and fleets and influence, someone would stand on this floor and present the containment motion again, and the margin might be different. But today, the answer was no. Today, the cage was not built. Today, the galaxy chose something other than fear. The formal session concluded with a motion to extend full council membership to the human delegation, replacing their provisional observer status with a permanent seat and all the rights and responsibilities that came with it. The motion passed by a wider margin than the containment vote had failed, which told me that the council was not unanimous in its welcome, but was practical enough to recognize that if you were not going to cage a throne species, you had better bring them inside the structure and give them a stake in its survival. Claire Ashford accepted the membership on behalf of Earth with the same steady composure she had displayed throughout the entire ordeal. No gloating, no triumphalism, no speeches about justice or vindication, or the moral superiority of a species that had just narrowly avoided being quarantined by the rest of the galaxy. She simply stood, thanked the Council for its decision in clear and measured language, and sat down. It was, I thought, the most human thing she could have done. The galaxy had spent weeks debating whether to imprison her species forever, and she responded with grace. Not because she was weak, not because she did not feel the weight of what had almost happened, but because she was strong enough not to need the satisfaction of reminding everyone in the room how close they had come to making a catastrophic mistake. The chamber emptied slowly. Delegates filed out in clusters, speaking in low voices, processing the implications of what had just happened, and what it would mean for the future they had chosen by a margin of 7 votes. The Vren Collective departed without a word, their chosen vessel moving through the crowd with the disconnected efficiency of a being that was already processing the next problem. The Draxians left in formation, their armored bodies moving with military precision through corridors that seemed to shrink around them. The hegemony's delegation withdrew silently, as they always did. Their presence felt more powerfully in the empty space they left behind than in the space they had occupied. I was gathering my files from the central podium organizing the data chips and display modules with the habitual tidiness of a lifetime spent managing information, when Claire Ashford appeared beside me. She had crossed the chamber floor alone, leaving her 3 colleagues behind at the entrance, and she stood close enough that I could see the fine lines around her eyes and the quiet intensity in her expression, the expression of someone who has been carrying something enormous and has not yet set it down. She said, "That precursor sentence you found, the unfinished one." I nodded. She said, "Perhaps if one were welcomed rather than—" "You spent a long time thinking about how it ends, did you not?" I said I had. I said it had kept me awake for nights. I said I did not know if the precursors had been about to say feared, or fought, or caged, or destroyed, or something else entirely. The sentence was broken, and the rest was lost to the erosion of billions of years, and no amount of linguistic analysis could recover what had never been written down. She smiled. It was the first time I had seen her smile, and it was not the practiced, diplomatic smile she wore in the observation booth. It was the smile of someone who has been carrying a heavy thing for a long time and has finally been allowed to set it down, if only for a moment. She said, "I think it was going to say welcomed rather than feared, and I think you do too. Thank you for finishing it." She turned and walked away. I watched her cross the chamber floor and rejoin her delegation at the entrance, where Daniel Perry and Liam Holt and Sophie Grant were waiting, with expressions that suggested they had understood the magnitude of what had just happened, even if they were not yet ready to fully process its implications. They left together, 4 ordinary-looking beings from an extraordinary world, and the door closed behind them, and the chamber was empty except for me and the lingering echoes of a vote that had changed the course of galactic history by the thinnest of margins. I returned to the archive that evening. The Codex terminal was waiting for me, its screen glowing softly in the quiet room, the same terminal where I had opened the Crimson Archive file and started everything that followed. I sat down in my chair, the chair I had occupied for 47 years, and I opened the precursor file one last time. The entry for the 3rd planet of Sol was still there. Throne of Endings, Crimson Archive. The annotation still pulsed in its ancient script, its warning as stark and unambiguous as the day it was written billions of years ago. Do not archive, do not name, do not wake what sleeps in gravity and bone. The species born here will remember what we tried to forget. I added a note. It was the first addendum to a precursor record in the entire history of the Galactic Naming Registry. No archivist had ever modified a precursor entry. The entries were considered permanent, immutable, as fixed as the laws of physics that governed the stars the precursors had mapped. But the Codex protocol accepted my addendum without objection, as if it had been waiting for someone to do exactly this, as if the system the precursors had built was designed not just to preserve their warnings, but to eventually record the moment when someone chose to move past them. The note read, "Throne of Endings, also known as Earth. Status, welcomed." I closed the file. I leaned back in my chair and let the silence of the archive settle around me like a blanket. The hum of the terminals, the soft glow of 900 billion planetary entries arranged in their careful rows. The weight of more history than any single mind could comprehend, stored in this room, maintained by people like me, who spent their lives in quiet service to the record of what had happened, and what it meant. And for the first time in weeks, my hands were steady. Outside the archive, the galaxy continued to turn. 1,000 species went about their lives, trading and arguing and building and dreaming, and doing all the things that living beings do when they are not being asked to decide the fate of an entire world. Most of them would never know how close the vote had been. Most of them would never know that 7 votes had separated a future of coexistence from a future of containment, a future of welcome from a future of fear. They would go on with their lives, and the humans would go on with theirs, and the galaxy would continue to be the complicated, messy, beautiful, terrifying place it had always been, with one small difference. There was a new entry in the Codex, a new note attached to an ancient file, a single word that carried more weight than all the data in the archive combined. Welcomed. Somewhere on the lower residential level of the capital station, 4 humans were sitting around a table, drinking coffee, and looking at the stars through a window that showed them a galaxy that had just barely, by the slimmest of margins, chosen to welcome them instead of fearing them. They were quiet. They were calm. They were patient, the way their world had made them patient. The way a species shaped by gravity and bone and millions of years of never giving up is patient. And somewhere in the deepest layer of the oldest database in existence, an unfinished sentence had finally found its ending. Not the one the precursors had written, not the one the Vithari had feared, not the one the hegemony had spent 11,000 years preparing for, the one the galaxy had chosen, by 7 votes, on an ordinary morning, in an extraordinary chamber, because one archivist decided to speak, and one species decided to hope. Welcomed rather than feared. It was enough. For now, for this moment, for this fragile beginning, it was enough.